My mother-in-law, Dolores Ferreira, has spent 11 years convinced that my son Lucas was a mistake she had to tolerate. She never said it quite that plainly, not until her 60th birthday party anyway. That night, in front of 43 members of her family, she picked up her champagne glass, looked at my child, and said into the microphone that her grandson was too slow to inherit anything. People laughed. Her sisters laughed. Her brother-in-law from Curitiba laughed so hard he spilled his drink. And my son, who is 11 years old and was sitting right there in his white button-down shirt that he had picked out himself because he wanted to look nice for his Avo's party, looked down at his plate and went very still in the way he does when he is trying not to show that something hurt him. I did not cry. I did not make a sound. I excused myself from the table, walked out to my car, retrieved the leather folder I had placed in my glove compartment 4 days earlier, and walked back inside. I sat down. I waited for Dolores to finish speaking. Then I stood up. Before I tell you what happened next, let me tell you how we got here, because some people in this family still believe Dolores was making a harmless joke, and I want you to decide for yourself. My name is Nora Scott. I kept my name when I married Renato Ferreira 6 years ago, and that decision alone told Dolores everything she thought she needed to know about me. To understand this story completely, you need to understand the architecture of the Ferreira family. Dolores is Renato's biological mother. She has three other children, two daughters, Camilla and Letitia, and a younger son, Felipe, all of whom live within 20 minutes of her house in the same neighborhood where they all grew up. Renato is the eldest and the only one who moved away, first to Sao Paulo for university, and then to the city where he met me. I am not related to any of them by blood. I am connected to this family through my marriage to Renato, and through Lucas, who is Renato's biological son and my stepson. Lucas came to live with us full-time 5 years ago when his biological mother, Renato's former partner, relocated abroad for work. I have been his primary caregiver since he was 6 years old. Dolores has never once acknowledged that distinction out loud, not to thank me, and not to use it as a reason to care about him more. She treats Lucas as an accessory to Renato, present but not particularly relevant. Lucas has a processing speed difference. That is the clinical term. His pediatric neurologist, Dr. Adriana Milo, has been working with him since he was 7, and she is clear-eyed and specific in how she describes him. He is perceptive. He is emotionally intelligent in ways that genuinely startle adults who expect children to be oblivious. He absorbs information deeply, which means he sometimes takes longer to respond, and that delay gets misread constantly by teachers, by strangers, by his grandmother as slowness, as deficit, as something broken. It is not. Dr. Milo has said more than once that Lucas will find his pace, and that when he does, the people who underestimated him are going to have to reorient themselves entirely. Dolores heard that assessment once, secondhand from Renato. She nodded the way she nods at things she has already decided not to believe. The first time I understood what we were dealing with was about 4 months after we married. We had driven up for a Sunday lunch, the whole family, long table, Dolores at the head of it, and she was telling the story of how she had found Lucas a spot in a local playgroup during one of our visits. She was proud of herself. I told them he is a little behind, she said, ladling rice onto her plate, but that his family is working on it. Lucas was 6. He was sitting right there. He looked at me, and then he looked at his food, and then he asked if he could be excused to use the bathroom, and I watched him walk away from that table with his small shoulders very straight, and I felt something cold settle into my chest that has never fully left. I did not correct Dolores that day. Renato gave me a look across the table, the apologetic look he had been giving me since before we got married, the one that said, please not right now, please not here, please just let it go. I let it go. But that night, after Lucas was asleep, I called my attorney, Helena Souza, and I asked her about updating the documentation in Lucas's trust. He had a small education fund that Renato and I had established for him, managed by Helena's firm as trustee, and I wanted to make sure everything was current. Helena asked me if something had happened. I told her yes, but nothing I could prove. She said, start keeping notes. I did. The second incident happened 8 months later during a phone call. Dolores called to discuss Easter plans and mentioned, almost as an aside, that she had spoken to Lucas's school. She had called his teacher, she said, to ask how he was really doing, because she did not entirely trust what Renato and I were telling her. The teacher apparently had been professionally vague in the way teachers are when an unauthorized adult calls and starts asking pointed questions. Dolores relayed this to me as a fait accompli. She had done the thing, it was done, and wasn't she just being a grandmother who cared? I held the phone and breathed in through my nose. I appreciate that you love him, I said. Of course I love him, she said, slightly offended that I had found it necessary to say. I did not tell her that the following morning I would be meeting with Lucas's school principal to document the unauthorized inquiry and request that a formal note be placed in his file. I did not tell her that I had already spoken to Helena about the question of educational guardianship and what paperwork might strengthen our position if anything like this escalated. I just said I appreciated that she loved him, and I meant it, and I got off the phone and went to find Lucas to ask him if he wanted to play cards. If you have ever been underestimated by someone who was supposed to be on your side, you know exactly what that particular silence feels like. It is not passive, it is load bearing. You are quiet because you are building something, and the noise would disturb the construction. The third incident is the one that made me accelerate my timeline. Luca's was 9. We were at Dolar's house for her birthday, her 58th, and after dinner, her brother Mauricio had too much wine and started doing what people like Mauricio do when they have too much wine, which is say aloud the things that everyone else has agreed to keep internal. He was talking about the family property. Dolars owns a house outside the city, inherited from her parents, that has been in the family for 3 generations. It is not a spectacular piece of real estate, but it is sentimental. And over the years, the land value has increased in ways nobody anticipated when Dollar's parents bought it. Mauricio, glass in hand, was explaining to nobody in particular that it was important the property stay with family, real family, and he glanced at Lucas, just a glance. Lucas was playing on the floor with one of his cousins and did not look up. But I saw the glance, and so did Renato, and so did Camilla, who looked away very quickly and reached for the bread basket. I drove home that night with Lucas asleep in the backseat and Renato's hand on mine on the console, and I said, very quietly, I need to talk to Helena this week. And Renato said, I know. And we didn't say anything else for the rest of the drive. I want to be careful here about what I am telling you, because I know how this sounds, and I know there is a version of this story where I am the outside woman who came into a family and decided to antagonize a grandmother who was just trying to love her grandchild clumsily. I have turned that version over in my mind many times. I have tried to give Dolars every possible benefit of every possible doubt. But a woman who calls a child slow in front of 43 people, into a microphone, at a party she invited that child to attend, that woman has been practicing. She has been saying the quiet version of that sentence for years, and on her 60th birthday, she finally said it out loud. The birthday party incident did not come from nowhere. It came from a long, slow accumulation of small decisions, and I had been watching every one of them. Let me tell you about Helena Souza first, because she is central to what happened. Helena has been practicing family law and estate planning for 22 years. I found her on a referral from a colleague of mine. I work in commercial real estate, and one of my professional contacts had used Helena's firm for a complicated trust situation involving a blended family, which is exactly the category Renato and I fall into. I first sat down with Helena in her office on a Thursday in September, 3 years before the birthday party. I remember the date specifically because I had just closed on a property that morning, a commercial unit in the eastern part of the city, valued at $420,000, which I had identified, negotiated, and secured on behalf of a client over 4 months of careful work. I was, by any reasonable measure, having a good professional day. I walked into Helena's office with my leather folder and my notes, and I told her I needed to understand exactly what legal protections existed for a stepchild in a situation like ours, and what would happen to Lucas if something happened to Renato, and what documentation we needed to have airtight in order to ensure that no extended family member could challenge his position. Helena listened without interrupting, which is one of the things I like about her. Then she asked me to walk her through the family structure, the assets, and the specific behaviors I had observed. I did. She took notes. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, You have been thinking about this for a while. Since he was 6, I said. She nodded. Then let's start from the beginning and make sure everything is right. Over the following 18 months, Helena and I worked through Lucas's trust documentation, which Renato and I had established informally early in our marriage and which needed to be formalized and bulletproofed. Helena served as the independent trustee. The fund itself had been growing steadily. We had been contributing to it consistently for 4 years, and Renato had made additional contributions from an inheritance he received from his own grandfather, Dolar's father, 2 years prior. Dolars did not know the specifics of what Renato had done with that inheritance. She had opinions about what he should have done with it, which she had shared with him at the time, and he had listened politely and then transferred a portion of it into the trust the following week. The trust covered Lucas's education through university, his medical care, including the ongoing relationship with Dr. Milo, and the cognitive support sessions Lucas attended every other week. And it had specific language Helena drafted carefully over several revisions, that addressed the question of who had decision-making authority over Lucas's care and education, and what would happen if that authority was ever challenged. It also contained an inheritance clause. I'm not going to tell you the specifics of that clause right now, because what I said at Dolar's birthday party was for her to hear first, in that room, in front of her family. But the clause exists. Helena put it there. The reason I kept all of this quiet within the Ferreira family is not complicated. Renato and his family have a relationship that is imperfect but real. He loves his mother. He is frustrated by her, he defends her in ways that sometimes frustrate me, and he has also, over the course of our marriage, grown more clear-eyed about what she does and what it costs Lucas. But he is her son, and I am not going to make my husband choose between protecting his child and maintaining a relationship with his mother unless I absolutely have to. That is not the strategy. The strategy is to make sure that, when Dolores pushes, because she will always push, there is nothing left to push against. A wall is not a conflict. A wall is just a wall. The second pillar of what I built during those 3 years was the property. I work in commercial real estate, which means I understand land value in ways that are not intuitive to people outside the industry. I also understand the particular vulnerability of a family property that has been held informally across generations. No updated deed restrictions, no formal succession plan, just the assumption that it would pass naturally to the children when the time came. The Ferreira family property outside the city was exactly that kind of asset. Dolores owns it outright. Her name is on the deed. But what she has never fully confronted, because nobody has ever made her, is that Renato is a legal heir, and that his legal position as an heir is something that exists regardless of her preferences about who counts as family. I am not going to pretend that the property is the point. The property is not the point. The point is Luca's. But property is the language this family speaks when they talk about who belongs and who does not, and so I made sure I understood it fluently. Helena had reviewed the deed at my request and confirmed the relevant legal considerations. We had a conversation, one of several, in which she was very direct with me. Your position is stronger than they think it is. The question is whether you ever need to use it. I told her I hoped I would never need to use it. She said, keep the folder current anyway. I did. The close calls came in the year before the birthday party, when Dolores started making comments that suggested she was thinking about the property more actively. The first one happened at Camilla's housewarming. We were standing in Camilla's new kitchen, Dolores, Letitia, and I, and Dolores was admiring Camilla's range, which was expensive and new and exactly the kind of thing Dolores appreciates as evidence of prosperity. She said, unprompted, that she had been talking to a lawyer of her own. I set my glass down on the counter very carefully. Just estate planning, Dolores added, waving a hand. At my age, you start thinking about these things. That's very sensible, I said. I want to make sure the property goes where it should go. Letitia was looking at the range very intently, as if the controls required significant study. Of course, I said. Renato would want to be involved in any conversations about that. He's your eldest. Yes, Dolores said, and the way she said it was not quite an agreement. I called Helena from the parking lot before we drove home. Not to panic, because there was nothing yet to panic about, just to update her. Helena said she's allowed to plan her estate. So are you? I told her I knew. Is everything current on your end? She asked. I told her it was. Good, she said. Then let her plan. The second close call was worse, and it happened 4 months before the birthday party. Lucas had a school event, a winter performance, the kind where children stand in rows and sing, and the parents fill the auditorium and take too many photographs. Dolores had come down for the weekend, which was unusual and which I should have read more carefully as a sign. She sat with Renato and me in the auditorium, and Lucas, from the stage, found us in the crowd and gave a small private wave that was specifically for me, and I gave him one back, and Dolores watched this exchange with an expression I could not fully read. Afterward, in the parking lot, while Renato had taken Lucas to get his coat from the classroom, Dolores stood next to me by the car and said, with a gentleness that I had learned to distrust, Nora, I worry about him sometimes. What happens to Lucas if things don't, if the situation changes? I looked at her. Between you and Renato, she said. I mean if something happened and the situation changed. Nothing's changing, I said, but if it did. Her hand went to the top button of her coat, touching it, adjusting it, the way she does when she is approaching something sideways. He needs stable family around him, real family, his grandmother, his aunts. I just think sometimes that it might be better for him if dollars. I kept my voice even. Lucas is loved. He is cared for. He has everything he needs. The documentation for his care and his future is in the hands of professionals who have been working on it for years. He is not at risk. She looked at me for a long moment. I just want what's best for him, she said. So do I said. We agree completely. I smiled at her. She smiled back. And when Renato and Lucas came out of the school building, Renato laughing at something Lucas had said, the four of us walked to the car together like a family, and I put my hand on Lucas's shoulder and felt him lean into me slightly the way he does, and I thought, 4 months. 4 more months, and this is over one way or the other. I did not know then that it would happen at her birthday party. I thought maybe it would happen over a phone call, or at a legal proceeding, or not at all, that Dolores might pull back, might recognize the wall for what it was, and decide not to test it. People surprise you sometimes. They choose grace at the last moment. But Dolores had a microphone and an audience of 43 people and a 60-year-old certainty that she was the final authority on who was worth something in this family. And my son was sitting right there in his white button-down shirt, with his hands in his lap, looking at his plate. The folder was in my car. Everything was in it. 4 days earlier, Helena had called me to confirm that the final revision of a specific document was complete and that I could collect my copy. I had driven to her office on a Wednesday morning, reviewed everything one final time, placed it in the leather folder, and put the folder in my glove compartment, because Dolores' party was that Saturday and I had a feeling, not a certainty, just a feeling that I might need it. It had been 3 years since that first Thursday in Helena's office. 3 years of notes and calls and revisions and quiet strategic patience, and all of it was in that folder in my car, and my son was looking at his plate, and the room was still laughing. Everything I had built for 3 years was about to be tested in front of 43 people. And somewhere in the parking lot outside, Helena Souza's personal cell number was in my contacts, and her office number was in the folder, and 3 years of preparation does not leave you feeling afraid. It leaves you feeling ready. The party had started at 6 in the evening, at Dolores' house, the one in the neighborhood where she had lived for 31 years, the one with the fig tree in the backyard, and the good dining room china that only came out for occasions she considered worthy. 43 people had been invited. A catering company had set up in the kitchen. There were balloons in gold and white, which Camilla had ordered because Dolores had mentioned once 4 years ago that gold was elegant. Camilla remembered these things. She was that kind of daughter. I had dressed Lucas that morning in his white button-down shirt, and he had asked me if he could wear his sneakers instead of the dress shoes, and I had told him the dress shoes, and he had made the face he makes, not quite a pout, more like a philosophical objection, and then put the dress shoes on without further argument. He is like that. He picks his battles carefully, which is something I have always privately admired about him. Renato had driven. I sat in the passenger seat with the leather folder in my bag, and at some point on the highway Renato glanced over at me and said, "You brought the folder." It was not a question. "I always bring it," I said, which was not entirely true. I had started bringing it to family events 3 months ago, after the conversation in the school parking lot, just in case. Renato was quiet for a moment, then, "My mother's not going to do anything today, it's her birthday." I put my hand on his arm. I know, he believed that, I am not sure I did. The first 2 hours of the party were unremarkable. Dolores moved through the room in a wine-colored dress that Letitia had helped her choose, accepting cheek kisses and compliments with the practiced grace of a woman who has been the center of attention long enough to make it look effortless. Her brother Mauricio was there, already holding a glass. Her sister Conceição had flown in from Recife. There were cousins I had met once, and cousins I had never met, and a small cluster of Dolores' friends from her book club who stood near the appetizer table and watched everything with the alert, interested eyes of women who would have opinions later. Lucas stayed close to me for the first hour, which he sometimes does in large family gatherings. Then one of Renato's younger cousins, a boy of about 13 named Theo, found him near the drinks table and pulled him toward the backyard, where some of the other children had organized something involving a ball and 2 trees as goalposts. And I watched Lucas consider for a moment and then follow, and I let out a breath I had not realized I was holding. Renato was talking to Felipe across the room. Camilla materialized at my elbow with a glass of sparkling water, because Camilla always noticed what people needed and acted on it before they asked, which is one of the things I genuinely like about her. "He's fine," she said, nodding toward the backyard. "I know." She looked at me for a moment. "You seem tense." "I'm not." She handed me the water and looked at the room the way someone looks when they're about to say something they've been deciding whether to say. She's in a good mood today. The best I've seen her in months, actually. A pause. I think it's going to be fine. I took a sip of water. I hope so. Camilla has always occupied an awkward position in this family. She is not cruel. She is genuinely warm, the kind of person who remembers your coffee order and asks real questions and means it when she says she hopes you're well. But she loves her mother with a loyalty that sometimes requires her to look away from things she would otherwise find troubling. I have never blamed her for this. I understand it. It does not make the looking away harmless, but I understand it. At 7:30, the catering staff began moving people toward the tables. The dining room had been expanded with rented tables into the living area, set up in a long configuration with dolers at the head. Renato was placed at her right. I was 2 seats down, between Renato and one of the book club women whose name I have already forgotten. Lucas had been seated at the far end of the secondary table, between Theo and a small girl of about 7, who was apparently Conciso's granddaughter. I watched Lucas find his seat. He arranged his napkin in his lap with a focused precision that I recognized. He does this when he is concentrating on seeming normal in a situation that requires performance. He looked up, found me across the room, and I gave him the smallest possible nod. He gave me one back. Dinner proceeded. The food was good. The catering company Dolers had hired knew what they were doing, and the wine was the kind that Dolers selects very carefully, because wine is one of the areas where she permits herself visible extravagance. Conversation at our end of the table moved through the predictable channels: Mauricio's recent trip, Conciso's grandchildren, a renovation project at the property, outside the city that Dolers mentioned once, and then moved past before anyone could ask follow-up questions. I noticed the property mention. I noted it internally and moved on. At 9:15, the cake came out. It was 3 tiers, gold and white to match the balloons, and everyone stood and sang, and Dolers blew out the candles with the serene expression of someone who is exactly where they want to be. She made a small speech: gratitude for the family, gratitude for the years, gratitude for the life she had built. It was genuinely graceful. I almost thought, she's going to be fine tonight. She's going to be exactly this, and we are going to drive home, and that will be it. Then Mauricio took the microphone. He made a toast that was intended to be funny and landed mostly as sentimental, and people laughed in the right places and raised their glasses. Then Conciso took the microphone and said something heartfelt about sisterhood that made Dolers touch her own cheek. Then a third person, one of the book club women, said something brief. And then Dolers reached out her hand for the microphone, and the room settled, and she looked around at her family with 60 years of authority in her face, and she began to speak. She thanked people individually. She mentioned her children by name, each with a specific detail: Camilla's steadiness, Letitia's warmth, Felipe's humor, Renato's determination. She talked about the grandchildren. She named them. She named Camilla's 2 daughters. She named Felipe's son. She did not name Luca's. I felt Renato shift beside me. Dolores paused. She lifted her glass slightly and looked down the table toward the secondary table, toward Lucas, who was sitting quietly with his napkin in his lap and his dress shoes on the floor beneath his chair. And of course, Dolores said, and there was a warmth in her voice that was real enough to be confusing, we have my grandson Lucas with us. Lucas looked up. He is a special boy. She said it with a smile. He takes his time with things. She paused again. The pause was too long. Something moved in her eyes, something that had been planning this, I think, for longer than tonight. At the rate he's going, he'll be too slow to inherit anything. The laugh started with Mauricio. It spread the way laughter does when someone with authority makes a joke and other people aren't sure whether it was funny but laugh anyway to be on the safe side. Several people laughed. A couple of the book club women laughed. Letitia made a sound that was almost a laugh and then pressed her lips together. Lucas looked down at his plate, not at me, not at his father, at his plate. I had 4 seconds where I was completely still. I registered everything in those 4 seconds with a clarity that felt almost physical: the sound of the laughter, the weight of the folder in my bag on the back of my chair, Lucas's small shoulders, Renato's hand gripping his wine glass beside me, the book club woman to my left who had laughed and was now looking slightly uncertain, as if she had heard something land wrong and couldn't identify what it was. Renato started to rise. I put my hand on his arm very lightly, and he stopped. He looked at me. I looked back at him and I said, very quietly, "Let me." Something in my voice told him what I meant because he sat back down. His hand was still tight on the wine glass. I stood up, not abruptly. I pushed my chair back carefully, the way you do when you don't want to interrupt anything, the way you do when you're excusing yourself to use the restroom. I touched Renato's shoulder as I passed him. I smiled at the book club woman to my left. I walked the length of the dining room, past the secondary table, and as I passed Lucas, I put my hand on the back of his chair for just a moment, barely touching it, not stopping, and I walked through the kitchen and out the side door to the driveway. My car was fourth in the row of cars along the side of the house. I walked to it, unlocked it, opened the passenger door, and took the leather folder from my bag where it had been sitting for 4 days. I held it in both hands for a moment in the cool night air. From inside the house, I could hear the party continuing. Someone had taken the microphone back. There was music starting. People were moving between tables with cake plates. I called Helena. She picked up on the second ring, which told me she had been expecting this call. Tell me, she said. I told her what Dolores had said exactly word for word. There was a short silence on Helena's end. Public setting, 43 witnesses? 43. And Lucas was present. He was at the table. He heard everything. Another brief silence. Then Helena's voice came back even and clear. You have the full packet in the folder? Everything, Nora. Her tone was the one she uses when she wants to make sure I'm certain. Once you go back in there and open that folder at that table, we are past the point of quiet resolution. She will know what exists. She will know what we know. Everything changes. I know. You're sure. She said it into a microphone, I told her. In front of my son, a pause, then go back in. I'll be available if you need me to speak to anyone directly. I hung up. I put the phone in my pocket. I walked back into the house. People were talking, eating cake, moving between seats. The music was low, something instrumental that Dolores preferred. I walked back through the kitchen, back through the dining room, back to my seat. I placed the leather folder on the table in front of me. I sat down. I picked up my wine glass and took a sip and waited for a natural moment in the conversation, the way you wait for a gap in traffic before you pull out. Renato was looking at the folder. His expression was very careful. Dolores was 4 seats away, receiving compliments about the speech from Conciso. She had not noticed me return. I let 30 seconds pass. Then I stood up again, and this time I did not excuse myself. I picked up my wine glass and I spoke clearly enough to be heard at both tables. Before anyone else speaks tonight, I'd like to say something. The room did not go quiet all at once. It quieted in patches, the way rooms do when someone stands up unexpectedly. Dolores turned. She looked at me with an expression of mild surprise, the expression of someone who has not expected this development but is not yet alarmed by it. Of course, Nora, she said graciously, because she was still in the part of the evening where she felt in control. I set my glass down. I opened the folder. If you are still with me, I want you to understand something about that moment. I had imagined it many times in the 3 years I had been preparing. I had imagined being nervous or triumphant or angry. I was none of those things. I was extraordinarily calm. The kind of calm that comes not from suppressing emotion but from having made a decision so completely that there is nothing left to feel ambivalent about. Before anyone else speaks, I repeated, looking at Dolores directly, I'd like to share what our attorney has to say about Lucas's future. The first shift happened in Dolores' face at the word attorney. It was small, a 2-second pause in her expression, a slight stillness like a clock between ticks. She kept her composure. She was good at keeping her composure. Nora, Renato's voice was low beside me, not stopping me, just saying my name. I felt him shift in his chair, and I knew without looking that he had straightened up. Conciso, across the table, set her fork down very carefully on the edge of her plate. Dolores lifted her chin slightly. I'm not sure this is the moment for. The toast you made, Dolores, was made in front of 43 people. My voice was pleasant and completely level. I think 43 people should hear the rest of it. A beat. Nobody at either table spoke. I looked down at the first document in the folder. This is a copy of the trust established in Lucas's name. Helena Souza's firm serves as independent trustee. Renato and I are co-grantors. I turned the page toward the table without handing it to anyone, just let it be visible. The fund currently holds enough to cover Lucas's education through university, his ongoing medical care with Dr. Milo, and his cognitive support program, which by the way has been remarkable for him. He is doing beautifully. I wanted everyone here to know that, since the toast seemed to suggest otherwise. Dolores' hand moved to the top button of her dress, the gesture I recognized from the school parking lot. She touched it, adjusted it. That is wonderful, she said carefully. I didn't mean to suggest, the fund also has an inheritance clause. I placed my hand flat on the next page. I'm not going to read the full legal language tonight because that's Helena's area and I don't want to misrepresent anything. But the clause addresses specifically what happens if anyone with a claim to Ferreira family assets attempts to contest Lucas's position as Renato's legal heir. Mauricio put his glass down. He had been holding it in that particular way throughout my first statements, loosely, the way people hold things when they're waiting to see if they need to put them down. Dolores' voice came out slightly different. Lucas is Renato's son. No one has ever questioned that. Tonight, you said into a microphone that he was too slow to inherit anything. I kept my voice conversational. in front of his grandmother's entire family, while he was sitting at that table. I glanced toward the secondary table. Lucas was looking at me. I held his gaze for 1 second, just long enough to let him see that I was not frightened. Then I looked back at Dolores. I want to make sure that statement is contextualized properly. The silence that followed lasted long enough that I heard someone shift in their seat near the window. Camilla spoke first from 3 seats down. Her voice was very quiet. Mama, I think Nora is right that it landed wrong. Dolores turned to look at her daughter, and in that turn I saw the first real crack, not in her composure but in her certainty. She had not anticipated Camilla. Camilla was her steadiness, her reliable agreement, the daughter who remembered the gold balloons. When Camilla said it landed wrong, something recalibrated. It was a joke, Dolores said, and even as she said it her voice was slightly higher than it had been. Everyone took it as a joke. Not everyone. Letitia said it very quietly from across the table, looking at her plate as she said it. It may have been the bravest thing I had ever heard Letitia say. Dolores looked at her. Letitia did not look up. There's a second document, I said, and Dolores' attention came back to me. This one is more relevant to the conversation you were having with Renato about the property, the family property outside the city. Every person at that table who knew the Ferreira family understood exactly what I meant by the family property. I watched the understanding move through the room like a current. Dolores went very still. That property is a private family matter. It is, I nodded. Which is why Helena drafted language that addresses Renato's position as a legal heir, specifically, what his stake in that property would be if it were transferred or modified without his consent or knowledge during your lifetime. I did not open to this document. I just kept my hand on the folder. I'm not saying any action has been taken. I'm saying the legal position exists, and it's documented, and Helena has reviewed it in full. The color had been receding from Dolores' face across the last several minutes in the slow, steady way of someone who has been standing in a room that is gradually losing air. She was not collapsed. She was not broken. But she was not anymore the woman who had just made a toast to 43 laughing people. She was a woman who was beginning to understand that the person across from her had been in this room long before tonight. Mauricio cleared his throat. He looked at Dolores, then at me, then somewhere between us. He did not speak. Concisa was watching me with an expression I could not entirely read, not hostile, but assessing, the way an intelligent woman assesses something she had not previously taken seriously. You had this prepared, Dolores said. Her voice had steadied itself. She was reaching for the authority she was accustomed to. You came to my birthday with legal documents. I came to your birthday with my son and my husband, I told her. The documents have been in my car for 4 days. I brought them because I had a feeling we might need to have this conversation at some point, and I thought your birthday was as good a time as any to stop postponing it. I paused. You chose the timing, Dolores, into a microphone. Her hand left the button of her dress and went to the table, flat on the tablecloth, pressing slightly. I would never do anything to hurt Lucas. I believe you believe that. The honesty of it surprised her. I could tell she had expected a different kind of fight. I think you love Renato, and I think you love your family, and I think you have a particular idea of what this family looks like, and who belongs in it, and what the future is supposed to hold. And Lucas complicates that picture in ways that make you uncomfortable. I think you have been saying things like tonight's toast for 4 years in smaller rooms, in quieter voices, and tonight you said it out loud because you forgot that Lucas was listening. Nobody at either table made a sound. But here is what I need you to understand. I turned to the next page in the folder, not to read from it, just to have it visible, just to let the physical presence of the documentation be part of what I was saying. Lucas is 11. He processes things in his own time, which is a gift, not a defect. He has a trust that will carry him through his education and his care. He has a father who adores him and a legal position in this family that is bulletproof. He also has me. I let that land for a moment. And I have been very patient for a very long time because I understand that families are complicated and that change is slow and that you were not trying, most mornings, to be cruel. But tonight you were cruel in front of 43 people, and I am his parent, and this is the part where I stop being patient. Dolores' eyes were bright. She was not crying. She is not a woman who cries easily, which I had always half admired, but the brightness was the kind that comes from emotion that has nowhere to go. Renato. Her voice went to her son beside me. Are you going to let her? She's right. Renato's voice was quiet and final. He had been sitting very still throughout everything I had said, and his stillness had been its own statement. She's right. We should have had this conversation a long time ago. Dolores looked at her son for a long moment. He did not look away. Something went out of her posture then. Not completely. She is a formidable woman and she does not come all the way down quickly, but something went out like air from something that had been held very rigid for a long time. I did not mean, she started. I know, and I meant it, but it happened. I closed the folder. What happens next is up to you. There was a long silence. The instrumental music was still playing somewhere in the background, too gentle for the room. Conciso, from across the table, reached over and put her hand on Dolores. It was the first time anyone had moved to comfort her. Dolores looked at her sister's hand. Then she looked at the table. Felipe, who had been absolutely silent through the entire exchange, now looked at his plate, at me, at Renato, and then at his plate again. He opened his mouth and then closed it, which was perhaps the most honest thing anyone in the room had done all night. Camilla exhaled. It was almost inaudible, but I heard it. The book club woman to my left had put down her cake fork at some point and had not picked it up. I sat down. Renato's hand found mine under the table. We sat like that, in the middle of Dolores Ferrera's 60th birthday party with 43 people around us, and gold balloons on the ceiling and cake plates half finished on the tables. And nobody spoke for long enough that eventually a cousin near the back of the room started a quiet conversation with the person beside him. And then someone else did, and the room slowly resumed its own momentum, the way rooms do when they decide the extraordinary thing is over. At some point, Lucas appeared at my shoulder. I had not seen him come in from the backyard. He stood beside me and put his hand on the back of my chair. Can I get dessert? He asked. Of course, I said. He went. He came back with two pieces of cake and put one in front of me without being asked because that is who he is. I looked at the cake. I picked up the fork. Dolores, at the head of the table, was talking quietly with Conciso. She had not looked at me again since I sat down. But at some point, not soon, maybe 20 minutes later, maybe 30, I looked up and found her watching Lucas, who was back at the secondary table explaining something to Theo with both hands, animated in the way he gets when he's found an audience that's actually listening. Dolores watched him for almost a full minute. I cannot tell you what she was thinking. I can tell you that she looked, for the first time in the 11 years I had known her, genuinely uncertain. Not in a broken way. In the way of a person who has just realized that they built their understanding of something on a foundation that is not as solid as they thought, and now they have to figure out what to do with that. It is not my job to tell her what to do with it. I already told her what I needed to. I am going to tell you what happened in the weeks after that night, because I know that is the part you want to know. Dolores called Renato 4 days after the party. The conversation lasted 47 minutes. I do not know everything that was said, because Renato took the call in the backyard and I gave him his privacy. What I know is what he told me afterward. She apologized. Not with qualifications, not with the particular kind of apology that is actually a defense of the original action. She apologized the way a person apologizes when they have sat with something for 4 days and understood, finally, the true weight of it. Renato told me her voice cracked once and that she did not try to recover from it quickly, and that struck him as significant because Dolores does not let herself sound cracked in front of her children. She asked to speak with Lucas. Renato told her he would ask Lucas what he wanted. Lucas, when asked, thought about it for a day. Then he said he would talk to her on the phone, but not yet because he needed a little more time. Renato told Dolores. She said she would wait. She waited 3 weeks. Lucas called her on a Sunday morning while I was making breakfast. He sat at the kitchen table and talked to her for 12 minutes about school, and about a video game he had been playing, and about the goal he had scored at the backyard game at her party, which Theo had apparently witnessed and reported back to the family with enthusiasm. I could hear Dolores' voice on the other end in the way you hear something through a phone when the room is quiet, not the words, just the shape of it. She sounded careful. She sounded like she was trying. Lucas said goodbye and hung up and brought the phone back to me and went to watch something on the television. Just like that. Children are extraordinary. They are built for the long view in ways adults forget. The documentation stayed with Helena. The trust remained intact. The property question was addressed formally over the following 2 months, with Renato and his siblings and Dolores all sitting down with their respective attorneys to document a succession plan that explicitly included Renato as an heir and was clear about what that meant. Dolores' attorney, I was told, had advised her to do this regardless, that it was sensible estate planning. Dolores agreed. Perhaps she had wanted to do it correctly all along and had just needed someone to stop letting her avoid it. Camilla texted me the week after the party. She said, I should have said something sooner. I wrote back, you said something that night, that mattered. She sent back a single acknowledgement, and we have not discussed it further, which is the right amount. Letitia called. She spoke for 40 minutes about her own experience growing up in that house and what it cost her to say anything, ever, and she cried at some point, and I listened to all of it because she needed someone to listen and I was the one who had stood up first. It is easier to speak after someone else goes first. I know this. I did not resent being the first. Mauricio has not called. Mauricio will probably never call. He sat at that table and laughed into his glass and will likely narrate this story to his friends as the night Renato's wife made a scene at a birthday party. That is his prerogative. I do not need his revision. Lucas is doing well. Dr. Milo said at his last appointment that his processing confidence has grown measurably this year, that he is taking longer to answer some questions because he is thinking more carefully, not because he is struggling. He scored in the top third of his class on a reading assessment last month. He told me about it in the car on the way home, matter of factly, the way he tells me most things, just a fact he wanted me to have. I told him I was proud of him. He said he knew and looked back out the window. I still carry the folder. Not to family events anymore, it lives in my desk drawer at home now, where I know where it is. Helena says it's in good shape, and that she'll let me know if anything ever needs updating. Renato and I are fine. Better than fine, actually. There is something that happens in a marriage when one person finally stops asking the other to choose between their child and their parent, and instead just shows the other person that the choice was never necessary, that real protection does not require an ultimatum. It just requires preparation. Renato held my hand under that table, and he has held it every day since in ways that are not always visible. Some of Dollar's family believe I went too far. A 60-year-old woman's birthday party. Legal documents on the dinner table, 43 witnesses. I have thought about that version of events honestly, and I cannot reach regret. What I can reach is this. She looked at my son and called him too slow in front of the people who were supposed to love him, and I am his parent, and parents do not get to save the hard conversation for a more convenient evening. So, did I go too far? Or not far enough? Tell me what you think.